Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 290, The Dynamics of an Asteroid. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you are the dynamic Burt Wolder.
I am the dynamic Burt Wolder. Yes, the reserved, modest, and diminished Burt Wolder has been put out to pasture, and now there's only the dynamic Burt Wolder.
Thank goodness. And I guess it rubs off, and if that's the case, we would be the dynamic duo.
Oh, wonderful. Where are our utility belts?
I left mine in the utility closet.
Oh, curse. I'll go get the mop.
It happens. Well, this is another episode where we are looking at a piece of Sherlockian scholarship of old, and in this case, it's one that is constructed in such a way that we think is worth your knowing about. We call this series Master's Class, and we do it every month. I think it's the third week of every month as we do this podcast. So stay tuned because you're in for a good ride about a piece of scholarship related to, of course, Professor Moriarty's master work. Meanwhile, if you'd like to show notes for this episode and anything that we mention today, any links that we have will go in these show notes. You can either open up your podcast player and look in the notes section there, or you can simply go to ihose.co/trifles290, all lowercase. We'll actually have that link in the show notes as well, so you can click from your podcast app, go over to our website. If you'd like to sign up for email updates, you can do that there. And we also have links to support us on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can have the pleasure of knowing that you help our production go on and on. At the end of every month, we do a drawing for free back issues of the Baker Street Journal, and every quarter we have a drawing for a free year's subscription to the BSJ. And what's more, we just made this announcement in the last episode. If you supply us with a topic for a Trifles episode and we turn it into an episode, we will send you some goodies from the Trifles vaults here at iHose Media Central. So think about that and feel free to get in touch with us through the website right there in the show notes. Well, as I said, this is Master's Class. We're looking at a piece of masterful Sherlockian scholarship. In this case, we go to the book Baker Street and Beyond, which was edited by Michael Harrison. It was an anthology of wonderful essays from a number of well-known Sherlockians. And one of them, interestingly enough, is known far beyond the Sherlockian universe. And that is today's author. We're talking about Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars for a number of years, but of course he is also known as a wildly prolific scholar. He was also a professor of biochemistry at my alma mater at Boston University School of Medicine. They never removed him from the faculty listing, even though he hadn't taught there for many years by the time I arrived. But Isaac loved to write. He loved to speak. He loved to hear himself. He loved certainly having other people hear himself as well. And Bert, you surfaced this from beyond Baker Street. Well, you want to set it up for us?
It's a wonder. Absolutely. I'd be delighted to set it up. Among other things, Isaac was considered one of the big three science fiction writers, along with Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. And he wrote or edited more than 500 books. And it was always fun in those days to encounter Isaac at a Baker Street Irregulars dinner, because he was perpetually creative. He traveled with a little notebook. He was always scribbling things, ideas down. And in later years, he had a little pocket recorder that he would turn on whenever he was giving a talk or singing a song. And I imagine he brought those tapes back to his office and gave them to an assistant and had them all typed up. He was amazingly prolific. But this particular...
And just one thing before you go on. His papers, I think, are at Boston University at the Howard Gottlieb Archival Research Center. And interestingly enough, Isaac Asimov, I don't know if he's the only author, but he's one of a handful, if he's not the only one, who has books in every single section of the Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a conversation with Isaac, either one that I was in or one that I read of although I think it was a conversation that I was in with him at a BSI dinner. And somebody, maybe it was me, who had asked him, he had just written this book about something. And I said, how is it that, of all the subjects in the world, you've written this particular book about whatever the subject was? And he said, well, whenever I have a subject that I'm interested in and know nothing about, I write a book about it.
That's a great way to learn something.
And so he was really a bit of a polymath. He had his own course of study and followed his own path. Well, anyway, this particular article about the dynamics of the asteroid. Now, that our listeners know that Professor Moriarty, at 21, wrote a treatise on the binomial theorem, which enjoyed a European vogue, and only a little later, the very more impressive The Dynamics of an Asteroid, which ascends, Holmes told Watson, to such rarefied heights of pure mathematics that it is said there is no man in the scientific press capable of criticizing it. Now, this was the challenge that Isaac had. What could be in the dynamics of an asteroid? And he pointed out in the little introduction to this essay that all of the scientists, by the way, I am going to mention in this essay are real ones who did exactly what I say they did in the year that I say they did it. And the reasoning is correct, and every astronomical statement that I make is correct, insofar as we know at present. So that's how this essay kicks off. And then we're right into Isaac's voice, because the way this essay begins, he says, "The Moriarty who is the monster of evil and the mastermind of crime we know well, thanks to the gifted pen of Dr. Watson. But the Moriarty who is one of the great mathematicians of all time we know only glancingly." And this is the sort of rhythm of speech that was very indicative of him. And his basic point, as this essay begins, is he says, "I maintain that from the title of this work, we can deduce the contents and even discover why the work was suppressed." And so he goes on to say, so by dynamics, the dynamics of an asteroid, dynamics, he says, means the study of the motion of a body and the changes introduced in that motion. And all of this is governed entirely by gravity. And first and foremost, he says, the gravitational influence of the sun. And this particular influence, this orbit that results, is modified by the considerably smaller gravitational influences of various planets, particularly the influence of Jupiter. And Jupiter has, Isaac didn't say this, but Jupiter has about 300 times the mass of Earth. So, and if you combine all the other planets in the solar system, Jupiter has the mass probably about 2.5 times of all of the other planets. And so that's why Jupiter has this remarkable ability within the solar system to influence the orbits of other bodies in the solar system.
And highly appropriate then that Mycroft in the Greek Interpreter, I think it was in the Bruce Partington plans, was said to be Jupiter descending when he visited Baker Street, because he has his rails and he runs on them, etc.
I like that, yeah.
How fascinating here that we have Moriarty as a mathematician. I mean, mathematics and physics, are very closely aligned. You can't have one without the other. But Moriarty was not a physicist. He was a mathematician. So for him to get into, the astrological mathematics and thinking about elliptical orbits and mass and movement and motion and all the rest, it's anathema to Sherlock Holmes, who really never bothered himself with the solar system and whether the Earth went around the sun. It's like the antithesis of Sherlock Holmes, even though Holmes was very logical and scientific in his own approach.
Yeah, that's true. That's a great observation. Well, and the connection you're talking about between physics and mathematics, Isaac gets right too, because he says the first asteroid was discovered in 1801 and was very hard to find. And he says there was a German mathematician, Gauss, who found he could work out its orbit from the few observations already made by using a mathematical measurement that he had invented called the method of least squares. And they found the asteroid again. And this method was based, among other things, on the assumption that Newton's theory of gravitation was correct. And all of this, Isaac says, was refined in 1857 when another astronomer showed that the asteroidal orbits were not spread evenly through space between the orbits of the planets Mars and Jupiter, but that there were gaps. And by 1866, it had been demonstrated that any asteroid circling the sun in those gaps would have a period of revolution that was some simple fraction. So there's some mathematics again, some simple fraction of that of Jupiter. Absolutely fascinating. So Isaac is sort of stepping through from Newton to Gauss to this other astronomer, the major developments along the way in the 19th century about understanding these motions.
Yeah, and that American astronomer was Daniel Kirkwood. And Asimov says that these gaps that Kirkwood identified are called Kirkwood gaps to this very day. And at that point, when you think about the scientific community, Asimov notes that astronomical achievements from American physicists and mathematicians were sometimes overlooked or even neglected in Europe. So it could have been possible that Moriarty in 1875, which was just 9 years after Kirkwood did his work in 1866, was kind of producing work in parallel. We see this happen in the scientific community all the time, where discoveries happen independent of each other on almost simultaneous timelines. Discovery of certain elements or properties of how proteins behave or whatever, when the scientists had no collaboration or no knowledge of each other's work. It's just kind of how things work out. So it could be that this demonstration in the dynamics of an asteroid could have been proof of Moriarty gaps in Europe. Asimov wonders, is that the case? Were there Moriarty gaps? However, Asimov very clearly says, no, this cannot be. Kirkwood's achievements were publicized, and the accomplishment, even though it's a worthy one, was beneath the level of Moriarty's ability.
beneath the level. That is just so indicative of Isaac. He will introduce questions and commentary that he thinks, would occur to people, probably because it occurs to him. Is this possible Moriarty had discovered something related to this? And then he goes on and answers the question, no, that cannot be. But in that way, he's building up, a very a progression. It's just like a stair step, of level to level.
Well, and we'll get into what's left and what Asimov thought was left that Moriarty could achieve in the dynamics of an asteroid right after this quick word.
When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today.
Okay, we're back, and we're ready to listen to more of Isaac Asimov's profound takes on Moriarty and asteroids. No. Come on, Isaac, down. I should note, though, we did have an earlier episode on Moriarty's mathematics. It was episode 219, where we talked more roundly about the binomial theorem and the dynamics of an asteroid. So that's a nice companion episode to pair with Isaac's analysis and supposition here in from Beyond Baker Street.
Yes.
Baker Street and Beyond, excuse me.
So Isaac, is taking us up these steps. He's introduced information about the solar system, given us some astronomical history, explored an alternative, said, no, that possibly couldn't be. What's left, he says. Can we conceive that Moriarty, so he drops a bit of a brick here. He says, can we conceive that maybe Moriarty had looked forward 40 years and anticipated the general theory of relativity, which Einstein gave to the world in 1916, and which served to correct and complete the Newtonian picture of the gravitational effect? Well, maybe, he goes on to say. But if he'd done so, he would have found out that all of that calculations that would have resulted added little to the dynamics of an asteroid. He says, as a little throwaway observation, he says, such calculations would, on the other hand, produce a much more noticeable correction in the motion of Mercury. And then he talks about that for a little bit, but then says, this dynamics isn't called, this essay isn't called the dynamics of Mercury, it's called the dynamics of an asteroid. Are we then at a dead end? Is there no way we can imagine what it was that Moriarty did? Well, wait a second now, he says. The title of this refers to an asteroid, the dynamics of an asteroid. Why is that? In 1875, we already knew a couple of score of these small bodies were known. And today, when he's writing this in the 1970s, some 1,700 are known well today, and there are many more now. Why an asteroid? Could it be that Moriarty had the idea that if you worked out the dynamics of one asteroid, you could understand them all? Well, no, because then the title would be The Dynamics of Asteroids. That can't make any sense. Could he be referring to one particular asteroid? Yeah.
Well, of all the asteroids known in 1875, Asimov notes, they had their orbits between Mars and Jupiter. Of course, that's if you look at a map of the solar system, there's that classic asteroid belt that is held between Mars and Jupiter. And Asimov says, at least from the orbital standpoint, none was particularly more remarkable than the rest. The first asteroid to be discovered that possessed an unusual orbit was Eros, which was spotted in 1898 by the German astronomer Witt. And its orbit was carried it within that of Mars to a point of within 14 million miles of Earth, which is fairly close in astronomical measurements. So perhaps, Asimov posits, Moriarty was anticipating Witt's discovery. Aha. And he says, yes, certainly, but then surely the title would have been The Dynamics of an Intra-Martian Asteroid, thus giving some indication as to why the author of a treatise should be dealing with a single asteroid. So he rules that out.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's very Asimovian. You know, he's having this sort of conversation on the page. How about this? Well, that's possible. Well, no, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. But he does it so elegantly, that he keeps you going.
And this is a wonderful way of anticipating objections of those who might be more well-informed than he, or those who perhaps considered something that they thought he might not be considering. And as you say, this conversational style is really engaging as well as illuminating.
Yeah. I have to tell you as an aside, this has such relevance in things like media relations and public relations and areas that you and I have worked in professionally. Years ago, I had one executive that I worked with at a big company whose practice was, when he was dealing with a belligerent reporter, to pause and to repeat in some detail all of the characteristics and descriptions of the reporter's question and the points. He amplified the negative. And at the end of all of that, he would say, I reject that.
Wow.
And then he would go on to explain why.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a lovely technique, and that's sort of what Isaac does here. And he takes us to, he says, okay, well, what's left here? He says there's one strong, overwhelmingly probable alternative. When the first asteroid was discovered in 1801, people were surprised that it was so small, but they were even more surprised that they found all these other asteroids. And a German astronomer, Olbers, discovered that in the space between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, a full-size planet had once, it was a speculation, not a discovery, a full-size planet had once existed, but that it had blown up in some cosmic catastrophe, and that it had in this way produced all of these small asteroids that now exist. And others took up this hypothesis, and surely, says Isaac, this is what Moriarty has been alluding to all along. His an asteroid, dynamics of an asteroid, must refer to the single asteroid planet that existed between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter prior to the catastrophe. And his study is that of the mathematical treatment, exorbitantly complex, of the effects of that explosion and how the fragments under the influence of gravitational attractions took up the asteroidal orbits of today.
And the remnants of Krypton come to mind. And with a master criminal like Lex Luthor, I'm sorry, Professor Moriarty, it seems entirely parallel. And Asimov says not only would the mathematical problem have been worthy of Moriarty's brain, not only would it have represented the first attempt of any scientist to take up so complicated an astronomical problem, but think how the very nature of the problem would have appealed to Moriarty. The destruction of a world. To a master criminal whose diseased genius strove to produce chaos here on Earth, to disrupt and corrupt the world's economy and society, there must have been something utterly fascinating in the vision of the actual physical destruction of a world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says, and so this is the conclusion. We're getting to the end here. He says, could Moriarty have imagined that on that original asteroid, another like himself had existed, one who would tap not only the vicious currents of the human soul, but even the dangerous forces of the planet's interior? Could he have supposed that this super Moriarty of the original asteroid deliberately destroyed his world, leaving the asteroids that now exist as the various tombstones that commemorate the action? Could he have envied the deed and tried to work out the necessary action that would have done the same to Earth? Well, if so, it's no wonder that a horrified scientific community has suppressed Moriarty's work.
Well, and of course, Moriarty, like many other scientists before him, well, every other scientist before him, his time came and went. And Asimov notes that after Moriarty, the concept of an exploded asteroid lost its appeal. There was a Japanese astronomer, Hirayama, who showed that no single explosion could have created the asteroidal orbits that now exist, but that 5 separate explosions of 5 separate smaller worlds might have done it. And to imagine 5 explosions is considerably less attractive than to imagine one. And modern astronomers generally suppose the asteroids to have been small fragments from the start, fragments that never coalesced into a planet because of the disturbing influence of Jupiter, once again. Oh, old disruptive Mycroft, Jupiter. And Asimov concludes with, the Moriarty theory has been rejected with horror and in all likelihood will never be revived.
Well, it will never be revived except on programs like this one, which reduces it to the simple word of a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
This is not danger. It is inevitable destruction.